Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to my panel, Generation Summers. My name is Aaron Bossig, and I'm the host of a podcast called Hungry Trilobite. I am also a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And while I might not be as big of a fan as some of you in the audience, I'm coming to you today with something I think we can all consider. I would like to take some time to reflect on how the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer perfectly captures all of its characters at a particular moment in time. Although the show has always been popular with people of many age groups, and the fans only continue to come in as the years go on, there's a lot of value in understanding exactly what life was like for Buffy and her peers. Buffy the Vampire Slayer found its niche as a show that used monsters and demons as metaphors for typical late teen, early adult life struggles. However, there were a lot of facets of the Scooby Gang that were not typical by historical standards. These kids in the show were born at a point when Generation X was essentially over, but the people that we now call millennials weren't really here yet. Being born at the very start of the 80s meant that you were a weird fusion of both. I feel like I'm in a solid place to comment on this. I happen to share a birth year and a graduation year with Buffy. And speaking with the many Buffy fans I know, I'm far from alone. I'm making this video as an example of what I'd like to call Generation Summers. This isn't to say that only people in our exact age group can enjoy the show. Far from it. Buffy fans are incredibly welcoming, and a good show is a good show no matter when it was made or when you found it. However, I can say with certainty that some of the things that make perfect sense to us members of Generation Summers will be completely strange to members of Generation X as well as to late millennials. Just a few years in either direction completely changes our frame of reference. In addition, the show was made at a very transitional point in TV history, and it's safe to say that if Buffy the Vampire Slayer were to be pitched at some other time, it would be very different, or it might not have been made at all. Just to make sure that I'm defining myself clearly, when I say Generation X, I'm referring to the people born between 1965 and 1980. These are the people who were raised by baby boomers and were in their formative years when Star Wars hit theaters. They know where they were when the Challenger exploded. Millennials, for the purposes of this panel, are the kids born from about 1984 to 1996. These are kids whose first game console might have been a Saturn or a PlayStation, and they don't remember Big Macs ever coming in styrofoam containers, and they never doubted that Elvis was dead. But they might have had their doubts about Tupac Shakur. Generation Summers, I contend, fits into the narrow category of kids born between 1981 and 1984. Generation X is known for being the generation with a high percentage of working parents, single parents, and as a result, a high percentage of latchkey kids. They were the generation that was most likely to enroll in college, and the one told by children's TV that they could be literally anything they wanted to be. And when being whatever they wanted to be ended up being too tall in order, the generation that collapsed into a heap of frustration, codified in the musical grunge movement. Older Generation X viewers will look at Buffy and see a lot of departures from their childhoods. Even though the show starts off with these kids in their high school years, the perspective it presents really de-emphasizes the importance of high school. While popular culture of the Generation X era would present high school as this extremely significant period of time, Generation Summers is a little more comfortable seeing it as just a middle step on the way to becoming an adult. Likewise, while Generation X was raised to think that college was the first logical step after high school, Generation Summers had to question this concept. This is because in real life, the cost of a college education in relation to how easily one could recoup the expenses of that education shot through the roof. Children of the 80s looked at college with a considerably different set of figures in their heads than did children of the 60s and 70s. And you can see this reflected in the show, where after high school, Xander immediately joins the workforce, and genius Willow Rosenberg declines going to a major giant university in favor of a more reasonable local college. And of course, there were in-universe reasons for these things as well, but when the millennials look at this, it makes a little more sense to them than it does to Gen X, and we're going to get back to that in just a minute. You also can't miss the rise of nerd culture in the mid to late 90s. While Sunnydale High ostensibly has these separate cliques of the cool kids and the geeks that were portrayed as mingling more than they had in generations past, it was looked as being a little more common. And granted, the unusual events of living on a hellmouth often prompted these two to mix a little more than they might have. But it was a bit unexpected in that, say, a football player faces a paranormal scare, and that prompts him as to come out of the closet as gay. That was a shock in the 90s, but it would have been unthinkable in decades prior. We're going to get back to gay representation a little bit later in this programming, but this would be a really good start to that. Generation X looks at Buffy and sees it as a tragedy that she didn't get to finish college. Conversely, when she doesn't have to care for her mother and she doesn't have kids in the run of the show, she's avoided a lot of the biggest and most stressful responsibilities a Gen X viewer might be thinking of. Gen X will look at Buffy, and they will not be so quick to accept slaying as her true calling in life. They're still going to be thinking, what about her day job? Whatever happened to the Double Meat Palace? This is just something that is not quite easy to accept from a Gen X perspective. When we talk about millennials, these concepts are going to be much more familiar to them. Millennials, especially late millennials, approach Buffy from a radically different mindset. When they reached adulthood, they were already accustomed not just to the internet, but to using the metrics of social media to define their lives. They got their Facebook account around the time they got their driver's license, if not before. They've never been on an airplane without having to take their shoes off. When the teacher in class gave out an incorrect fact, they were able to grab their phone, hit Google, and correct them right then and there. Millennials grew up in a system that values instant feedback, and this has given them a reputation for being impatient. I'm going to argue that that's probably just a sign that they usually think there's a better way of doing things. And I'm going to further argue they're not usually wrong. The biggest separation between Buffy and her younger millennial fans, especially Gen Z, is the complete lack of parental supervision in her life. Buffy is able to get out and patrol at night only by climbing out her window. She and her friends are able to spend all night tracking down monsters even though none of their parents know where they are. It's tempting to write off this lack of parental supervision as simply a trope for convenience of the show. And it's true that that's probably a part of it. TV shows often enable teen protagonists by just writing off the parents altogether. But for members of Generation Summers, we can attest this was reality. Generation Summers was the last batch of kids who didn't need to be watched 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Subsequent generations have grown up with parents always knowing where they were, and the parents face enormous social pressure to maintain that level of surveillance. In the 90s, it was common, even kind of expected, that teenagers would get together after school and your parents wouldn't know where you were. They might know where your friends were, and if they trusted your friends, they trusted that you were reasonably safe. This is why when Willow and Xander did a round robin and made a pact to lie to their respective parents about where everybody was spending the night, it actually worked. And ironically, this level of trust and confidence in your teenage child came about at a time when cell phones were almost non-existent. You couldn't really communicate with somebody after they left the house. Smartphones hadn't hit the mainstream yet. We could argue they hadn't even been invented. And cell phones that did exist were very primitive compared to what we have now, and very few people had them. At this point, if you wanted to reach somebody after they left the home, your best bet would have been to call them up and leave a message on their answering machine at home and hope they called to check it, or start calling places you think they might go or might go soon. Does it sound like a pain? It was. It really, really was. But this was normal life. If you, not only, this was normal life. It was assumed that when you walked out of your house, you were not reachable until you walked back in again. And it kind of adds to the danger that Buffy finds herself in on a regular basis when you remind yourself that not only does she have no way of calling for help, but nobody really knows where she is, and they have no way of locating her if she goes missing. So what were kids doing when they went out? They went to malls, which really aren't there anymore. They hung out at music stores, which they've also declined in importance. They're still there, but they aren't really the draw that they were back in the 90s. And sometimes you just drove around endlessly, which was something you could do when gas was less than $1 a gallon. There's another separation for the younger fans that will be difficult to process. Willow teaching computer class and being the only one who knew how to use the internet. For most of the 20th century, technology was a decision. You paid attention to it, or you didn't. Your life didn't really change that much either way. If you chose not to really watch technology, you adapted to it at your own pace. Most things up until that point, when a new technology came out, it took years or even decades to hit the mainstream. TV, microwaves, VCRs, they crept into our lives very slowly, over the courses of years or even decades. Personal computers took the same path, and they were a novelty item for a very, very long time. What you see during the show's run going into the 21st century is the very first time people they had to pay attention to technology. It was no longer an option. If they didn't pay attention, they couldn't keep track of what was going on in the world. Life started moving at the speed of Twitter, but that started during the Buffy years. And it wasn't just Twitter that drove a wedge between millennials and Generation Summers. Spotify has a role too. Buffy is a show that had a strong musical component, from its theme song by Nerf Herder, to the garage bands at the Bronze, to pop songs that were punctuating the most poignant episodes. The problem was the music in Buffy is very, very Gen X, which is owed to the fact that all the showrunners were themselves very, very Gen X. It's somewhat easy to brush that aside because it's still awesome music, and people's taste in music is very personal, but people tend to develop that taste in music in their teen years. And for a show aimed at teens, the music again forms a fingerprint on the taste of the era in which it was created. So millennials are unique in how they acquired those musical preferences. Unlike boomers, Gen X, and even us Generation Summers, millennials didn't follow bands by buying entire albums and seeing an artist's work progress in stages. They were very much more likely to listen to individual songs streamed over the internet, and thus were open to much more nuance and variety in their music than their predecessors. For comparison, the first time us Generation Summers kids were able to do something like that, it was on the original release of Napster, which was released well after we finished high school, and our tastes were pretty well cemented by then. And while garage bands were still very popular in the millennial group, they're not quite the same as they were before. The subculture at the Bronze likely makes a bit less sense to them than they do to their Generation X brethren. Millennials looking at Buffy the Vampire Slayer will see a childhood that doesn't just look familiar to them at all. In their minds, the lack of technology will make it the equivalent of Little House on the Prairie, and the social structures will be a step above Lord of the Flies. It wasn't just the viewers themselves who were unique to the story of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Far from it. The show itself was a product of its time as well. In the late 90s, the TV landscape was already starting to see some pretty radical changes compared to the way it had been for decades prior. For years, the story of TV was the story of the big three networks, which were CBS, NBC, and ABC, all competing against each other, and every once in a while, this cable TV, which was off to the side would throw a monkey wrench into the mix. The big three networks would hash out their big shows, and every once in a while, some cable TV show would get a little bit of press here and there. But the 90s saw a weakening of that model. With newcomer networks competing with the others like Fox and UPN and the WB, Buffy originated as a show on the WB and was willing to give a network, the WB, that was desperate for new content, good content. They were willing to give it a chance. Other more conservative networks were not, and so they had to give Buffy a little bit extra to make it worth their while. What you were seeing at the time, although no one knew it yet, were the first steps toward the TV as we know it today. By creating more networks, more places to put programming, viewer loyalty to any one particular network was starting to fade away. This became clear when Buffy jumped from WB to UPN midway through the series, and viewers didn't really notice. They didn't really care. They made it clear that they were paying attention to the content, not the channel that hosted it. That's something that today is second nature, but at the time, it gave people pause. In today's world of app streaming, we give comparatively little attention to who distributes our content, but that's the end of decades of breaking away from the big three networks model I mentioned before. The late 90s also saw the rise of serialized fiction on TV. Whereas shows with long continuity arcs had always been considered untenable because viewers were watching them out of sequence on reruns, and they would struggle to follow them, or at least that's what the networks thought, rabid fans who enjoyed following long stories were getting frustrated. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a prominent example of a new breed of shows that rewarded people who watched a series from beginning to end, and it joined the ranks of other series of the time like The X-Files, Babylon 5, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It's also worth looking at what was going on in Joss Whedon's mind when he committed to the series. Today, we know him as an industry juggernaut who's worked on giant movies from Marvel and DC. He's one of the names among names. But in the mid-90s, Joss Whedon was still something of an up-and-comer. He'd had notable success working as a script writer, a script handler on movies like Speed and Twister, but he wasn't yet somebody you'd consider a household name. Yet. It was very clear that he could go in that direction. And many screenwriters in Hollywood had gotten that far, but never been heard from again. So to succeed, Joss would have to get involved in the right project. And by all accounts, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was not it. You have to figure out, in the 90s, movies were considered to be a more prestigious format of media than TV. The culture where we have now, where the two are kind of interchangeable, is a more recent phenomenon, a very recent phenomenon actually, largely created by streaming media. Back then, people who worked in TV aspired to work in film and not the other way around. If somebody was going from film back to TV, it meant they were taking a step down in their career. They probably screwed up something and had to pay the bills by doing lesser work. That's not something we think of as much today because, again, movies and TV are almost interchangeable, but at the time there was a huge, huge distinction. As silly as it sounds, and we're going to deal with a lot of silly ideas here, the idea was that if you went to the movies, the audience was coming to you. If you were on TV, you were going into their homes and coming to them. And as stupid as that may sound to us, that was the logic that was used, and that was how people made business decisions based on things like that. According to Joss, his agent begged him not to take the Buffy the Vampire Slayer project for that very reason. And obviously he did anyway. But you have to add that to the fact that the Buffy series was connected to a movie that was not particularly well loved. Add that to the fact that TV shows based on movies tended to not do well. This is something that, again, has only changed in very recent times. The 90s were filled with failed movie-to-TV adaptations like The Crow, The Mask, RoboCop, Dangerous Minds, and Back to the Future. And that's not an exhaustive list. Most of those projects were extremely unpopular. By all accounts, using 90s logic, Joss Whedon was jeopardizing a very promising career to take a step backward in his career on a project that showed absolutely no promise. But let's look at the content of Buffy the Vampire Slayer for a minute and why it was a bit different than anything else you'd seen on TV up to that point. At the time, writing primary characters to a series as gay was not only a very new concept, but it was something the audience had embraced and expected it more almost immediately. And it showed that the networks had underestimated the audience for a very, very long time. People were tired of being told they couldn't handle certain stories because someone might be offended, or that they literally weren't smart enough to follow a story. Yes, I said that. Back then, TV network executives frequently used that as a reason not to make shows. They thought that the audience would be too stupid to understand, or they would be offended at something that somebody else did, and this was done openly. You, the audience, simply got used to the idea that TV network executives thought you were stupid. So Joss Whedon agreed to do a show, seemingly to the detriment of his career, for a network that was not really known for delivering popular content. The carrot that had been used was that he could have creative control, and this choice was to use a format that was considered wildly unpopular and unconventional. So where did he go right? While admiring how radical of an idea the Buffy series was, you also need to take into account that so many things we cherish about the show were only possible because of a great deal of compromise. Today, we celebrate the fact that Buffy was able to show a lesbian relationship. But at the time, how to do that was not exactly clear. One success that Buffy had was that they established that Tara and Willow's relationship was not endlessly going to be milked for sex appeal, and they were not going to be treated like a joke. Both of which at the time were popular ways of getting to a same-sex couple on screen. If you didn't make them a joke or really play up the steam factor, it just wasn't going to happen. Showing a naturally developing, sincere, caring relationship was just not something that was done, but Joss Whedon insisted that's how it would go down on his show. Bear in mind, the first appearance of Tara was in Hush, which premiered less than 3 years after Ellen DeGeneres' character came out of the closet on her show as gay. So the stage was set that it was possible to have a relationship on screen, broadly, but the specifics still made the networks very uncomfortable. Showing a same-sex couple being physically intimate was still kind of a bridge too far. So Tara and Willow used magic as an allegory. Something that works due to the format of the show, because it's a show about magic, but it still feels like a bit of a letdown to a community that was finally seeing some representation and not seeing it carried through 100% of the way. Likewise, the Buffy series is often faulted for not having a more racially diverse cast. However, the original design of the show actually was to have Cordelia Chase be a woman of color. The reason she wasn't was that Joss Whedon made it clear that he was writing the show with a very long game plan, knowing that several characters would become romantically involved with each other. And that the networks did not want to take into account the factor of an interracial relationship. Yes, even in the 90s, interracial relationships were still a topic that was considered untouchable. So Cordelia was changed into a white girl so that the overall design of the show would continue. So you have a show that maintains a giant story arc, like very, very few shows prior ever had, something the TV networks only recently allowed, and was only possible because the newcomers to this TV scene were desperate for programming that didn't outright suck. However, because of the new ability to write giant stories, we had to curtail some of the more radical developments in casting because of some of the prejudices that were outdated even then. Because some people wrote nasty letters in the 60s and 70s, the networks largely continued social norms from that era. And I can tell you, as somebody who was alive in the 90s and a regular TV watcher, although the networks made a big deal and a lot of noise about these taboos they had to maintain, regular people like you and me honestly didn't care that much. Like I said before, if you watched TV in the 90s, you were just used to feeling like the networks thought you were stupid. In a way, I'm selling the show short by pointing out that it was a product of its time. The TV world of the late 90s, in truth, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was the reason a lot of those old conventions could finally fall by the wayside. You could easily credit Buffy with popularizing a lot of serialized fiction and raising the bar on dialogue and creating a new wave of shows that were aimed at teens and treated them and their perspectives seriously. After Buffy, the smart teen drama became a very significant subgenre, so much so that the adult demographic started to become a big part of their audience. You're writing a smart show, suddenly the adults want to see it too. Imagine that. Buffy and Joss Whedon in general could also share some of the credit for taking TV away from the network model of the 20th century and showing us a world where the distinction between a movie and a TV show is very blurry, and people get their content wherever they want it, when they want it. TV shows are now expected to have complicated plots and large stories, and treating the audience like they're stupid just isn't tolerated. I'm not saying TV today is perfect, far from it. But as a fan, I have much higher hopes that an innovative show that wants to get started today can find an audience, because sci-fi is a commodity now. It's a popular genre, and your audience is only finding the right streaming service away from your new show. We aren't relying on misconceptions that are decades out of date to decide who would like something and who won't. At this point, a good show is a good show, and we'll find it. To summarize, Generation X will not find Buffy to be very familiar in terms of how it presents her older life, and Millennials will not find the show to be very relatable in terms of how it portrays her younger life. Having said that, those are both very broad generalizations, and I know there are lots of exceptions to each one of those trends. In no way am I trying to speak for every member of every generation. And I also acknowledge that the TV and film industry are incredibly complex, and a lot was left out of the analysis. So how do we wrap this up? Normally, at the end of a panel, you turn the topic over to the audience for questions, but since this is a panel of one, and it's pre-recorded, that's not going to be an option. I could just say, thanks for coming to my TED Talk, but I think that's taken by somebody else. Probably the most productive way to end this is to address the elephant in the room, the supposed reboot. Bearing in mind what a perfect storm the creation of the series was, it's sensible to look at the possible reboot that's currently in the works and draw the conclusion that it couldn't possibly work. Please understand, that is not my motivation for putting this talk together. If the new show succeeds, it won't be because it recaptured the magic of the original series. Rather, it will be because it found its own unique identity and made the most of its own set of unique circumstances. Until I've seen it, I won't speculate. I will, however, ask that all the fans, young and old, continue to love this show. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of WhedonCon.